What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video, and in this one I'm going to be building an immensely powerful $1,300 gaming PC build that is going to kick ass at 1440p gaming. I'll be building this system inside a brand new case from Montage, which looks pretty special, basing it around AMD's legendary at this point 7900 GRE, and showing you guys what you really can get for under $1,300. Let's do this. The Cooler Master GM34CWQ2 is a 34-inch ultra-wide gaming monitor set on a 1500R curve with a sharp 3440 by 1440 resolution. The quantum dot panel is rich and vibrant, while the stock 165Hz refresh rate can be overclocked up to 180Hz for extra performance. AMD FreeSync Premium support, a 0.5 millisecond response time, and 4000:1 contrast ratio make this monitor both practical and a panel that looks the part. Learn more at the first link in the description below. I'm going to begin by talking through the case. It's not typically the most exciting part, especially in more value-oriented builds, but I'm looking forward to building these components inside of this. Now, this is Montage's latest XR, and it's a case I first saw and got hands-on with at Computex not that long ago. Ironically, that's one of the things I like about it, is that it was shown at Computex and now you can actually buy it. And in its first couple of weeks, I'm led to believe has been one of the best sellers in the budget case space, which is, wow, pretty impressive, really. Now, first impressions are that build quality feels okay. These panels have got a little bit of flexing, but nothing that's going to cause any problems. And inside, the internal layout looks pretty good. So, of course, room for standard ATX motherboards, two reverse intake 120mm, which is a nice touch, as well as a 120mm exhaust at the rear. This is resembling to me a lot of the cases we're seeing right now, very similar to a Height Y40, but obviously with cheaper materials. Power supply shield is nice, lots of ventilation down here at the bottom. Not going to do a great deal for airflow, but it's, I suppose, good to have. Obviously, the sacrifice you make with these kind of cases is this glass panel at the front. That's naturally going to cause more restrictions when it comes to airflow, but it looks pretty sick, and that's what most people care about. And of course, we've got the I/O down the bottom, power, reset, HD audio, two standard USB 3s, and a Type-C. So far, so good. Now at the rear, cable management space does strike me as being quite limited, though there's plenty of room for long power supplies, 2.5-inch drive mounting bays at the rear, a nice large cutout, and all the fans, while there's no RGB controller included, do come daisy chained and pre-run. This is some of the better fan cable management I've seen. Have a look at this recent MSI build I did, which, yeah, didn't look quite so good. For an example of just one thing I might be referring to. Let's move on to the components that are really going to make gaming happen here and really going to give us the good performance. And start with, of course, the GPU. Now, this is the Radeon RX 7900 GRE, and if you watched my recent video where I talked about the best cards for 1440p gaming, it doesn't get much better than this. Now, this comes with 16GB of VRAM and was previously only sold in China, hence the GRE, which actually stands for Golden Rabbit Edition. Now, this card actually has created a bit of a product overlap for AMD. Before it landed in the rest of the world, the 7800 XT would have been my go-to, but for just $50 more, even less in some scenarios, you can find some cards on Newegg now for about $530, the GRE makes a lot of sense. And the performance uplift, while only between about 7 and 10% depending on the title, is still more than worth it for the extra price that you pay. Now, this particular model is from GeekaWhat, but my honest advice would be not to get too pent up on the AIB partner you go for when buying a card like this. This system clocks in at under $1,300, and I'm sure you could get it close to $1,200 if you really needed to, though I'll leave latest pricing and availability, as always, at the affiliate links down below. This cooler has 3 large fans, which is pretty nice. I find the 7800 XT to be a fairly power-efficient card, so in some senses this is overkill, but it is going to fit in the case nicely and help to give the whole build a nice full look a little bit later on. In terms of what I'm going to pair up with the GPU, I've gone for the AMD Ryzen 5 7600 Non-X. Now, James, what about Ryzen 9000? Yeah, wow, what about it? The only chip we've seen that would arguably compete with this from AMD in their new setup is the 9600X. Now, that comes in at about $280. This on Newegg right now is like $184. It's the lowest price I've seen the 7600 since it came out. So unless you're really bothered about the next generation of chips, which, let's face it, based on the reviews and the data, don't really provide that much performance, stick with this and save yourself yourself the cash. The thing that a lot of people aren't talking about in these CPU reviews is that at higher resolutions like 1440p, where the GRE is very well suited, you're more likely to run into a GPU bottleneck than a CPU one. So just save the cash and buy a 7600. Now, of course, one of the great things about Ryzen is the upgradability. And while the upgradability might not seem quite as tantalizing now Ryzen 9000 has proved to be, well, a bit of a letdown, it's still great to have. And we're expecting to see Ryzen 10,000, when that probably lands in a year or two, support these same motherboards too with a compatible BIOS update. It's a big advantage that AMD have got over Intel, and of course the lack of any fiery, voltage instability issues, which is probably the bigger point. Now, B650 is all round a great chipset because it allows motherboard brands like GeekaWhat, Asus, MSI, ASRock and others to build boards that aren't ridiculously expensive, but still give you some of the core functionality you come to require and expect when building a decent gaming PC. Of course, AMD Ryzen is DDR5 as standard. You get memory overclocking in the form of AMD's Expo profiles, and you'll find as well plenty of NVMe connectivity. The top slot on this GeekaWhat Eagle board is actually PCI Gen 5, giving you good upgrades for next-gen NVMe drives. Really like this Eagle board, good connectivity, Wi-Fi as standard, and again, price-wise, often can be found for not much more than $150. The same here in the UK, about £150. Great! Now, I'm also going to be installing the RAM and the SSD. I'm going to do all this into the motherboard early on. I've gone for the Team Group Vulkan DDR5. This is under their T-Force gaming brand, and actually comes with a lifetime warranty. It's pretty impressive. What I really love about this stuff is its price. Yes, it doesn't have flashy RGB, and it's not quite as glitzy as some of the other kits out there. However, it has low latencies, fast speeds, and is incredibly affordable. The cheapest DDR5 I've found that looks half decent for a build like this, and it's really reliable, right? Like, we've used a lot of Team Group DDR5, and only second to Corsair is it the easiest from a compatibility, Expo, XMP standpoint. Storage-wise, I've also gone for a little bit of a channel favorite. This is the Crucial P3 Plus. 1TB, you can find this again for about $50, $60. The 2TB costs you about double, and it provides surprisingly good speeds at that PCIe Gen 4 bus. You're not going to saturate Gen 4 up to 7 gigs, but you'll get a good chunk more than the 3 gigabytes that you're limited to when it comes to Gen 3 NVMe's. So with all of those components said and done, it's time to install them. I'm going to kick things off with the CPU. That's of course going to go in our AM5 socket. Just match the triangles up and pop the arm back down. Memory is going to go next to the processor in slots 2 and slots 4, while of course the NVMe drive will follow afterwards. I'll be using the top PCIe NVMe slot for this, as it has an inbuilt heatsink, which will help to keep the drive cool and keep a lid on temperatures too. Really nice and simple, and these parts are super easy to install. You might notice that I've not yet installed a CPU cooler, and that's because the CPU cooler I'm going to use for this build has been delayed in shipping. Disappointed! I'm going to use a unit from Johnsbro with a fairly large heatsink design, an RGB black top plate, and included a 120mm fan. I'll add that on a little bit later, probably tomorrow once it's got here, so you'll see that a little bit later in this video. Now, with all of that sorted, that means it's time to move the motherboard assembly into the case. Now, looking at the chassis, and all of the standoffs appear to be in the right place. As usual, there are 3 standoffs at the top, 3 standoffs down the middle, and 3 down the bottom. The standoffs look a little something like this, and that's what you want to go ahead and screw into. The pre-installed rear I/O makes this step especially easy, so just grab the board by some of the heat sinks, the plastic bits, not the bare PCB if you can, and just persuade it into place. Once it's looking a bit more lined up, shimmy it on in. This case is a little bit tight actually. One criticism is there is not a huge amount of room top and bottom, so it can be a bit more fiddly. Montech, no! There are no raised standoffs to hold the board in place. So you've got to sort of screw it in and hope for the best. Luckily, there is a bag of included screws under the case paraphernalia, including a cleaning cloth, some cable ties, and rather handily labelled the motherboard and the SSD screws. And you can see exactly what they look like in this little bag right here. Get those screwed in, 3 at the top, 3 along the middle, and 3 down the bottom, and the motherboard is installed. Typically at this stage, you might be tempted to then install the graphics card, but I'm going to tell you, don't do it. Instead, install the power supply. Now I've gone arguably a bit premium for this build. I've gone Corsair's RM750E. To be honest, you could save yourself about $10 or $15 picking up Thermaltake's Smart BM3, which is also ATX3. But this is, I think, the slightly better play. I haven't used this unit too many times, but it's got some of the best reviews of any of the units around on the market, and that has to be a good thing. It's also cybernetics certified, but it looks as though Corsair have got rid of the 80+ certification. Either way, cybernetics platinum is more than good enough for me. The advantage of this unit over a couple of the cheaper options, including that Thermaltake Smart, is that this is fully modular, meaning you only actually plug in the cables you need. Talking of which, the motherboard is the first of those, and it looks like that installs nice and easily down the bottom, so just get it clicked in. It's 2 components. There we go. Followed by a single 4+4, so 8-pin CPU power connector. Chuck that in there. Also going to add in a SATA power harness just for any RGB controllers. Not actually sure if we're going to need it for this build, but I find it's good to have, especially in the future. If you do lose the other cables, which I, again, recommend you don't, just nice to have it pre-run and already there. And then our GPU power connection. Now, this power supply, rather handily, comes with the older style, which is what the 7900 GRE uses, and it comes with this, which is the new style PCI Gen 5 with the sort of 12 power and 4 data pins. Good to have, good to keep that safe if you ever do swap out for a graphics card in the future that's a bit higher end. That is the cable you're probably going to be using. Pretty traditional power supply installation in this one. Seeing all sorts of funky case designs now where the power supply is going sideways and at the back and in a different chamber. Nice and simple here, 4 screws, and again, those come included and are clearly labeled with the Montech XR. Nice to see. As far as cables and wiring is concerned, I'm going to start off with the power cables. Motherboard is going to go to the right-hand side, just to the right of the RAM or memory. CPU power is going to go up to the top left. GPU power is, of course, going to wait until later once I've installed the graphics card. Also a good idea at this stage to put in the front panel cables. HD audio goes down to the bottom left-hand side of the motherboard. JFP1 to the right, followed by both of the USB connections. First up, I'm going to do USB Type A. This is the larger connection, followed by USB Type C, which is the smaller, compact cable that powers the USB-C port on the front of the case. The next port of call is the GPU, and it's actually the final component that needs installing in this build. Now, looking at the case, you can see actually the quite wide open nature of it means the card is going to look really quite good. Now, what I'm going to do is just loosen this rear bracket first and foremost, and then hover the GPU over the PCI slot. I need to take out the second and third PCI lanes. Unscrew those one by one, push the clip on the GPU slot back, and slide the GPU into place. Give it power with those 2 8-pin power connectors I just plugged up the power supply a few moments ago, and then we should be good to go. And with that, the build is nearly ready to go. All that's left to do is add the CPU cooler in when that arrives tomorrow and boot this thing up to check out performance.
24 hours later.
It is indeed the next day, and the Johnsbow CR1400 has arrived. I think the product naming scheme could do some work. It feels very small, like a lot smaller than I thought. Maybe this isn't a 120mm fan after all. Oh, that is small. Got this a bit wrong. It's tiny. I think it might be a 90mm fan. Let's see how it looks. Yeah, it's basic. I think it's going to be fine. I'll let you know if the temperatures on this are terrible very soon. So remove the protective cover. Shout out, by the way, to overclockers.co.uk here in the UK for sending this out. I think they have this listed for like under £15. That's like the equivalent of like $17. I mean, you know something's cheap when the thermal paste comes in a bag and not a tube.
What?
Brackets wise, squarey ones are Intel, so we don't need those. The more straight ones are AMD. So what I'm going to do is flick the cooler upside down. See there, we've got some screw holes, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add on the brackets are going to face, I guess, outwards, and then the screws that come included are just going to go through each of the holes, through those brackets, and into the cooler itself. And then these 4 screws are going to actually fasten through the holes around the CPU. You'll see this board has some plastic brackets pre-installed. I'm going to remove those, add the thermal paste, and place the new cooler on top, plugging in the fan and RGB cables to their respective locations. With everything all now wired up, the fan's plugged in, and the power button is on the front somewhere. There it is. Is it going to turn on? I see some lights. Okay, no, cooler's spinning. A little bit noisy. No RGB at the moment. It looks like it's all good. It's just the RGB that we're waiting for. Give me a few moments to sort this out, and then we'll look at looks and performance once I'm in software and I've got all the ARGB nicely configured. build looking good and the very small CPU cooler looking, well, small but performing pretty well, it's time to look at that all-important frame rate data in all the games we've tested today. The first game on the list was Alan Wake 2. As usual, ran at 1440p high and set FSR to quality, and the build performed really well, breaking through the triple-digit FPS mark and standing at 101 frames per second. Call of Duty's Warzone at 1440p high, again using FSR on the quality preset, further improved performance. Frame rate this time right up to 171 frames per second, giving you a nice, competitive, playable gaming experience. Starfield was the next title on the list, and 1440p high were the settings I used this time around too. Here the build achieved a strong 98 FPS on average, pretty pleased with this, and I thought the game looked visually really great. Hogwarts Legacy is another set of great results for this GRE based PC build. 1440p high and the build again achieved a pretty stunning 122 FPS on average. Strong frame rates across the board. Moved through into Fortnite at 1080p competitive settings and I was pleased with performance here too. The build really nearly got to that 300 FPS mark with 275 frames per second on average to be precise. Apex Legends rounds off a really strong suite of benchmarks for this build, and at 1440p high once again the build achieved a fantastic 231 frames per second. This is a build that really means business at 1440p, and for its sub $1,300 price point I was impressed with how well it performed in all of the latest AAA titles. If you want to buy any of the parts mentioned today, they will be included at the affiliate links in the description below. Get subscribed to see more from me, thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.